Hey, it's Chris Lisle, the Executive Director of the Touring Career Workshop, and just want to take a quick moment and thank the CMA for their partnership in being able to help us provide this video series. You know, we're always striving to put out some unique content that's relative to our industry, and their partnership has allowed us that opportunity, and we're very, very grateful. Today, we're talking on the topic of rebuilding your finances, and joining me today is a longtime friend and an important part of my business life and personal life, my financial planner. And today we're joined by Troy Von Haefen, who's been an asset and a resource to the Touring Career Workshop since we started in 2011. Troy, welcome.
Hey, Chris. Good to see you. Good to be with you as always. Spend some time talking about finances. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're both busy as things start to ramp up here, so let's dive into it. So we're coming out of a pandemic, as we're all aware, and this pandemic has affected everybody a little differently, especially financially. You know, some people in some industries remained at work as normal, but specifically for the industry we work in, most of us, the live entertainment industry and the music industry, we were pretty devastated without work. And because of that, people had to go through different resources to be able to pay their bills, whether that's unemployment, PPP loans. But a lot of people also used other resources. You know, they got into their emergency fund. They got into maybe some credit card debt. So, you know, what are some things that, I guess my question to you, the first question is, why are we even having this conversation about rebuilding your finances?
Yeah. You know what? That's a great question, Chris, because, look, this pandemic really threw us a loop, right? Threw a big curveball to us. And especially the music industry, as you mentioned, that there were other industries that were not impacted to the degree that the music industry was. And it's tough. It's tough. The good news is we're coming back out of it, right? People are getting back to work, and I'm thrilled to see that. But, I think that the big thing is to talk about here is, why are we having to talk about it? I think people just weren't prepared for emergencies at the level that they should have been. And some of that may have been, there's a psychological term and theory called recency bias, right? So recency bias just means that you think about what's happened recently, and you're biased in that direction. So my point is, since 2009, the economy has been phenomenal, right? Everything has been churning along really, really well. And all of a sudden, in 2020, we get hit with the pandemic. So we had 11 years of spectacular growth, strong employment. And people, I think, just maybe thought in the back of their heads, yeah, maybe I could lose my job, but I'll get another job. But they didn't think, hey, we could really be hit with this curveball. And so therefore, the fact of really having an emergency fund or an emergency plan in place that was strong enough just wasn't there. Matter of fact, I had a client email me at one point and said, hey, you know what, Troy, I really didn't listen to you. I don't have the emergency fund in place that you'd recommended, and now I'm kind of hurting. So we had to dig out a little bit. And so I think that's pretty common, and especially maybe more common with younger people, is my point, who had not been in the workforce long enough to maybe experience '08 and '09 or 2000 to 2002. So that recency bias tells us that, hey, everything's good, nothing's bad's going to happen. So why should I have an emergency fund? That's not fun to have an emergency fund, just that money sitting there. That's not sexy, but we need it. So yeah, I think that's why we're here, why we're, having to talk about it, because we just weren't as prepared as we should have been.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally see your point. That kind of brings me up to my next thought. So here's the good news. One element of good news is we are starting to see our industry come back to life. I wouldn't say, I've used the faucet analogy. The faucet's not on at full, but it's trickling and it's getting faster. Yeah. In other words, shows are starting to happen. Tours are being announced. Festivals are happening. So people are getting back to work. So let's talk about this idea of the emergency fund, whether that be rebuilding what you spent over the pandemic out of it or creating a new one. But let's also talk about that as it relates to credit card debt. So in case somebody over the pandemic depleted their emergency fund or never had one, but also ran up credit card debt. how do you balance that? How do you get that emergency fund either built or replenished and deal with that credit card debt? What's some thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, there's a ton of questions that you have in there. And let me start here first. Just by talking about the emergency fund a little bit more, when we look back historically and what happened with the pandemic and what a lot of people did to survive it, look, an emergency fund may not have been 100% protective, right? But the thing that we want an emergency fund, and this is really, really important, is to keep us from irreparable damage, right? Stuff that we can't repair, right? So if you had something happen that's so bad that it's going to destroy you financially for your lifetime, that's what we want to avoid. And that's what an emergency fund's for. It's not about perfect that, hey, you know what, we've got this pandemic and everything is, butterflies and rainbows. No, it's not that. It wasn't that for people who had emergency funds and were fully funded in their emergency funds. It was still hard. It was still traumatic. But again, it's about understanding what the role of that is, and that is to stop the irreparable damage. Now, directly to your question about, where do we start? What do we do? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to become stable, right, financially. And that just essentially means we have to stop leaking oil before we can fix what might be considered broken. We have to stop leaking oil. So we have to stop going backwards and we have to start going forward financially. And that just means that we have to start bringing in more than we're, sending out every month. So, there's a couple different ways to look at this. One is, just looking at what your spending is, obviously, and maybe we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But I think the question that you're really getting at, Chris, is, how do you know when you've got some money coming in, where, how much to put in the emergency fund, how much to put towards the credit card? And there's a lot of people out there with a lot of opinions on this, but I think to some degree it's going to be unique to everybody. It's going to depend on the interest rate of the credit card debt. It's going to depend on your level of risk. And what I mean by risk is, again, the risk of future work, of future income. The greatest asset that you have is your ability to earn, right? So it's not the assets that you have in your investment account or in your bank. If you're still working, your greatest asset is you, right? So you have to assess that risk from that perspective. Okay, I've got a steady job now. Things are good. I feel comfortable. Well, at that point, then, maybe start splitting the difference a little bit, right? Because you want to have some cash in an emergency fund. But, you don't want to repair your emergency fund first while you're paying 19.5% in credit card debt. So, we want to chip away at that. So, maybe what I would say is do a little bit of both until you get a small amount in your emergency fund that would cover, I need new tires on the car, and it's $600-700 or whatever that might be. You want to be able to handle some type of an emergency like that. And by the way, that brings up a really good point here. What's the difference between an emergency and something just being a pain in the backside, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and I can talk in large terms too, right? So for example, if the HVAC unit on your house goes out, if it's in the middle of July or August, that's going to feel like an emergency, but that's really not an emergency. That's a pain, right? And financially, it could feel like an emergency because it might be 10 grand, 5 grand, whatever it is to replace. But a true emergency is something that causes you to drop a tax bracket or two. Okay, so just think about that for a minute. A true financial emergency is something that causes you to drop a tax bracket or two. So if we think about it in those terms, that would really help us define what a true emergency would be. And that's why we want those emergency funds. So again, going back, we want to have a beginning emergency fund to handle that stuff that's just kind of pesky, right? And then when we have a little bit of cash there, let's start knocking out the debt on the credit card side.
That's great, and I love that the way that you're looking at that, and I agree. That's a definitely a great route to start digging out of some of this mess. So, but I also was thinking too, for those that might not have ever had an emergency fund or who need to replenish, do you have some general 30,000 foot view guidelines as to what amount are we looking for in an emergency fund? Like I've heard in the past different analogies, like is it 2 months of typical salary, or do you have any basic guidelines as to what you like to define as that amount we're targeting for?
Yeah, and it's a boy, it's a moving target for a lot of people, right? And here's why. Um, I'll use you as an example, Chris. Okay, because I think a lot of people know who you are and know what you do inside the industry, right? Chris Lisle owns Chris Lisle Lighting Design, right? So you're a business owner. Now compare Chris to a tenured Vanderbilt professor, right? So now let's just look at that risk, right? I mean, it's very obvious, right, that Chris, you're susceptible to much more risk than somebody who's got a very, very stable job over here. So what that means in terms of emergency funds is your emergency fund needs to be stronger, right? Because the likelihood of something happening to them doesn't mean that they don't need one, but theirs might look different. It might be in different places inside their financial world. They may not need as much what I call ready cash as you would.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of different just general rules of thumb about it. 3 to 6 months of expenses. So if you're in the music business, I would definitely move towards the 6 month side versus the three
Gotcha.
month side. I use a little different thought process when I look at it. I look at it as a two-prong approach. I look at it as an emergency fund package, and I'll try not to get too technical and too deep here. But the way that I look at it is I look at you need ready cash and you need true emergency funds. Okay, so and it goes back to what I talked about earlier, the difference between an HVAC unit going out and you dropping a tax bracket or two. So for ready cash, my rule of thumb, and by the way, what I'm going to tell you is considered the gold standard of emergency funds. So a lot of people who's going to listen to this may hear this and go, "There's no way I can get to that. That's just too crazy." So just think of it as the gold standard. If you can't get there, think of it as being aspirational. Okay. So on the first side, on the ready cash side, you should have 10% of your income in accessible cash. Okay. So I like to use round numbers just to give good examples. So let's say somebody makes $100,000 a year. So you should have $10,000 in ready cash at your bank ready to go. Okay. Now, the second piece of that is a little more complicated. You should have, for true emergency funds, you should have the greater of either 20% of your income or 20% of your mortgage balance, whichever is greater. All right. So let's say that somebody has, that same person makes $100,000. They have a $250,000, or that let's say they have a $350,000 condo, and they owe $250,000 on that condo. So their
Mm-hmm.
emergency fund package would look like in ready cash $10,000 in ready cash, and then in true emergency funds they need to have 20% of their mortgage balance, which is higher than 20% of their earnings, right? So they're going to need to have $50,000 in ready cash. I'm sorry, excuse me, in emergency funds and
Gotcha.
true emergency funds. So the total package should be 60 grand, right?
Okay.
And you can run these numbers yourself and see and play with them. But again, the complexities with this get to where those assets are held, right? So ready cash really should be ready cash in a bank account, and true emergency funds can be spread out over different vehicles. I won't go too much into that because it gets very complicated. Um, but you can even hold emergency fund cash in a retirement account. I know that sounds crazy and this could be controversial to some, but if you've dropped two tax brackets, and you got to get cash in your IRA and pull it out and pay a 10% penalty, you're still paying less tax. Um, excuse me. But, it's something that you have to do the right way is my point. So please don't take this as, hey, I'm going to put all my emergency funds in an investment account, in my retirement account, and have them invested, right? The key here is it has to be liquid cash ready to go. So if you have an IRA and you've got some of your emergency funds in there, it better be in cash. Okay.
Gotcha.
Because safety trumps yield.
Safety trumps yield. I've heard that before and I like it.
Yeah.
So
So
let
that
me ask
just
you this.
essentially means, yeah, sorry. So that just essentially means that, if you need safety, the cash needs to be safe more than it needs to be growing.
Right.
We
Absolutely.
have other vehicles to make things grow, right? So we need to build the foundation and set the foundation first. This goes back to the whole, what we mentioned earlier about, people not being prepared. Their financial foundation may not have been as strong and as sturdy as they thought it should have or thought it was, right?
Right.
And that's what caused the problem.
Here's a question for you, and this is more just kind of your opinion. Is our emergency fund, these funds that we're talking about, this amount, can that also be used like if you have a long-term financial goal? For instance, if I want to buy a home and I'm saving for the down payment, can that also be part of that emergency fund? In other words, I save up this money and then I pay that down payment, then replenish my emergency fund, or should I truly treat those as two separate things? In other words, I have my emergency fund, but then I need to save for my down payment. How do you like to approach that?
Well, I always tell clients, and you've probably heard me say this, Chris, that I don't like working with hard edges, right? And what I mean by that in context of your question is, it's never cut and dry. So let's say somebody needed $60,000 for an emergency fund, and they needed another $50,000 for an additional down payment when they sell their house, whatever the numbers might be. So that means their total need is going to be 110 grand. Look, I wouldn't want somebody to take $50,000 out of their emergency fund, only leaving 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
But somewhere in between, sometimes we can do that. And again, it depends on the situation. Everything is situational again, right? So it depends. Chris Lisle, being a business owner, you take on more risk. The tenured Vanderbilt law professor, who knows they're going to have a job, right? Maybe could cut that a little closer. So, look, it doesn't always have to be perfect, but we have to understand where your personal risk lie in your financial world, and then make the decision as to how close you want to cut it from there. And that's where sometimes talking with a professional can give some real guidance and an unbiased third party opinion. But to your answer, just to be very quick about it, I don't think it has to be perfect. In a perfect world, yes, 100%. I would love to see that with my clients, but does it always work out that way? No.
Gotcha. I was just more curious because that is in my personal life, that is something I'm looking at and how we like to treat those monies and knowing, whether they can be that same pool or separate, but I'm totally tracking with you and that makes sense for sure.
And we have to remember
So,
too that if somebody is, if somebody's looking to buy another house, right? So they're at one level now of a need in an emergency fund, and then they buy a house, their emergency fund need is going to increase, right? Because that second part is tied to your mortgage. So we just have to take all of that into account, just to make sure that we're, not going to get hit with another curveball.
Gotcha. Yep, absolutely. Let's shift gears for a second and let's talk a little bit about budgets. Especially having worked with you as my financial advisor for almost 20 years and the plans we had in place, what's become important to me is budgets. And I have a Chris Lisle personal budget, and then I have my business budget. And one of the first things I did as soon as the pandemic really hit our industry, which I always use the date of March 13th, 2020 is kind of the date that all the gigs went away. I sat down and immediately re-looked at those budgets. I looked at the Chris Lisle budget and I looked at the company budget and started making some firm but tough decisions as to where I needed to be to protect myself financially. Like, can you speak a little bit about the importance of budgets and some budget basics that people might want to keep in mind as we start to move out of this and getting back into
Right.
work.
Right. Well, again, budgets are one of those areas where you're going to get a lot of different opinions on it. There's a lot of different methods to look at this, and a lot of things we can try. But the basics is we want to spend less than we earn, right? Because that's how we're going to get ahead. We want to have discretionary monies left over every month, and those discretionary monies are going to be the things that we should be able to use to develop wealth, right? So if we go back to that $100,000 number, let's say that their take home, I don't know, let's say they take home $80,000 a year, but they spend $90,000 a year. They're not going to last very long, right? So understanding conceptually that, we need to spend less than we earn, and we need to figure out how we can see that or know that to be true, right? And there's several different ways to do that. You can track it. There's lots of different tools out there now online that you can look at. You can use a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet to track it, but just essentially determining how much you spend every month. And, so that's looking at it from a, kind of a historic perspective. Hey, what have I spent in the last 12 months? And maybe even the last 12 months is not a good example. What would I spend during normal times versus pandemic times? To determine how much you need, right? And that's the key. We all should be able to know, how much do I need every month to live? So here's a good bit of homework assignment for everyone out there. Figure out how much you need to live on every month. You should know that number right now. Like, I know my number, right? Chris knows his number. I'm pretty darn sure he does, right? That's important. So when you're talking about budgets, you have to have some baseline information, and that's the key: is how much do I need? Okay. And then, looking at that need, what's my mortgage? What's my car insurance, homeowners? What do I spend on food, eating out, and entertainment, whatever, kids, soccer, all the stuff that you spend money on. How much do I spend? And how much do I need? Right. And then there's some variable things that are in there that we saw. One of the things that came from the pandemic that was really interesting is people spent less money. Right, because we weren't, and it was unfortunate for a lot of restaurateurs out there because people weren't going out to eat as much. They just weren't spending money on entertainment, which hurt us on the the music industry. But people weren't spending as much. So understanding what you need is the basis that you need to determine where to go. Right. So once you determine that, then you can track it in a multitude of ways. To figure out how you're doing with that, and comparing that to your income, right? And once you see that number, and look, you have to be honest with yourself. There's no need to lie to yourself to say, hey, I only spend this, where in reality you spend that. That's not going to do you any good. You're just going to make it worse. So be really honest when you evaluate your budget needs. And set a budget, and make it, number one, make it realistic, right? So don't tell yourself you're going to spend $50 a week on groceries when you spend $300 a week on groceries if you've got a big family or whatever. So be realistic. And number two, find a way that you can measure it. Okay. Whether that be using some, I know there's tons of apps out there that will allow you to do it, whether you use an app or a spreadsheet, or you use a simple method to where you just watch what's in your checking account, right? So, for example, if you start with $1,000 as cash in your checking account every month, and you put in X amount of dollars, knowing that you're going to spend X minus $1,000, let's say, at the end of that month, you should have $2,000 in your checking account, right? So you follow the math. You started with 1,000. And
Hmm.
let's say you bring home 8,000, like in the prior example, but your budget need that you've determined your budget is you spend $7,000 a month. So that means you started with 1,000, you brought in 8, which gives you 9, but you spent 7. Now you should have 2. So at the end of the month, you'll be able to see that and measure it. That's a
Yep.
way that you can measure it. So look, I put clients into 2 categories, and Chris, you'll probably laugh at this because you've heard me say it a bunch. There's either I categorize clients as either engineers or poets, right? Engineers, I'm not talking about train engineers. I'm talking about engineers like math, right? How they think about
Hmm.
stuff, the people who love spreadsheets, right? And then poets, a lot of musicians are poets, right? In that regard, meaning how they look at it. The difference between the two is the engineer out there is going to, they want to look at a spreadsheet. They want to see everything in a very small, fine detail. The poet, looks at their checkbook or logs into their bank account and says, wow, I get paid tomorrow. I've got $200 in my account. I'm going out for drinks tonight, right?
Hmm.
So it's a different way of looking at it. So understand where you are on that spectrum, right? And again, be honest with yourself, because if you're the poet, working with an Excel spreadsheet may not be right for you. And if
Right.
you're an engineer, you know, doing just the checking account method that I laid out earlier is probably not going to be detailed enough for you either.
But to your point, too, and going back to our previous conversation, when you're talking about in that scenario that $1,000 left over in that account at the end of the month, that's probably the prime opportunity to start using that money to enhance or create emergency funds and pay off debt. Correct?
Right. And the way that you would do that, again, we'll go back to that example. You start with $1,000 in the checking account. You bring in 8, but you only spend 7. At the end of the month, you've got 2. You started with 1. You're $1,000 ahead over here because you've got 2. So then you take that extra 1,000 and then you send it out, right? You send it to pay off credit card debt, put towards your emergency fund, or other things you're working on. Once we get restable and you get your foundation built, right? That's how you develop wealth, right? I mean, you can look at those numbers and multiply them, but you think, wow, at the end of the month, if I have money left over, if I put that away for tomorrow for a house, to buy my next car, or if you've gotten even past that, then you invest it for the future, and again, it's not all or nothing. We're going to be should be doing a little bit of everything along the way, to help you get there. But that's a great point to bring up, Chris, because that is exactly right. That would be considered discretionary money, and we need to use that discretionary money wisely, right? And that's why, I always say, using discretionary money to, put towards an emergency fund to pay down debt, towards future purchases for retirement. That's the way to go versus looking at the end of the month. Hey, I've got $2,000. I'm only supposed to have 1,000, and you spend it on beer and pizza. That's
Right.
not going to get you anywhere. And I like beer and pizza. So
Absolutely. So shifting gears just slightly, I want to talk to in the big financial picture of someone's life about the retirement. It's obviously a very big part of what you do, at least in my experiences and opinion, because we've talked a little bit today so far about the what ifs in life, those emergencies and things. Then we talk a little bit about the right nows in life, our budget. But an important part of someone's financial world is also the later in life, the retirement plan. And I definitely have a few questions and topics I want to talk with you about that. And I think my first question is for those that might be watching that are either younger or older, or is it ever too early or too late in life to start getting a retirement plan in place?
yeah, no, good question, but the answer is no. Definitely not too early. The earlier the better. It's amazing the power of compounding. So absolutely start early. Start as early as you can. It's so important. Um, and it's not too late either, right? Will you be able to be, if somebody's in their 50s and don't have anything, don't give up. Get yourself in a better position. Go out there and do it. And the thing about retirement plans that people forget is that a lot of these retirement plan contributions that we make will save you tax dollars because they're pre-tax, like a 401k, an IRA contribution, a SEP, a simple, or a solo 401k for business owners, right? So these things save you tax dollars. So it becomes a compounding thing. So, if somebody makes a $10,000 SEP contribution and they're in the 25% tax bracket, it's going to save them at least $2,500 in taxes. So when we start talking about, I can hear it now. I can hear people kind of thinking out there, now you're asking me to do retirement contributions when you were asking me before to pay off credit card debt and rebuild my emergency fund. Well, again, I think this really does prove my point of how we don't have to do one thing at a time. We can do multiple things along the way. And, so for example, if you do your tax planning throughout the year correctly, you make a $10,000 SEP contribution. Let's say you get $2,500 back in a tax refund. Well, that tax refund then can go back towards paying off credit card debt or towards the emergency fund to rebuild that. So we can't look at each thing individually. And this is really, really important. You can't just look at, I'm going to just pay off my credit card debt. I'm just going to rebuild my emergency fund, or I'm just going to worry about taxes, or I'm just going to look at retirement planning. We have to look at it from a holistic perspective. And that's where you really start seeing synergy in your financial world, is by looking at it from that perspective and taking that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody's different, and especially in our industry, some people are paid as an employee. Some people work for a vendor or an artist who may or may not have a company retirement plan in place. But a good portion of our industry, and in fact, in a recent TCW survey, I think it was about 60% of our industry are 1099 contract workers. And just one thing that I've done in my career, because everything I do is contract work, is when I get paid from a show, because I have to pay taxes, obviously, on that work. I always take 25% of that those monies, and I set them aside in an account. And you and I've talked about this before, but that is what I call my tax and retirement money. And basically, what I do is I take that money and obviously pay my taxes first, my quarterly payments, and then my final payments at the end of the year if I have them. But whatever that chunk is that's left in that account at the end of tax filings is what I look at as my going into my retirement. And that's what we've done historically is retirement. So that's just one idea I wanted to pitch at people, unless you think that's a horrible idea, but it's worked for us so far. But a way to maybe treat your money.
Yeah, no, it's great for those who are self-employed. And look, it's for you, that number, that 25% number might work out. For other people, it might need to be different, right? I like to push new business owners to a higher percentage so that they can get on the front end of things, right? We've been working together long enough with you to where you're good with taxes every year. We don't have any surprises. You're not writing checks at the end of the year. We're usually rolling money over into the next year, which keeps that percentage for you working lower. Sometimes for business owners, I push them to 40%. Which sounds debilitating, right? But here's the thing. Remember, this is still your money, right? So if you're taking, again, somebody who makes $100,000 in revenue as being self-employed, they're going to put $40,000 away. They're not going to need $40,000 for taxes. But they'll have money that they can then put towards retirement. But they could also, it's also their money set aside in a separate savings account. So if something really did happen, and they needed that money, they'd have access to that too. So, again, sometimes taking a conservative approach like this can really be beneficial. And I like pushing yourself, especially in the beginning at a higher percentage. You've done this long enough. We've worked together long enough between me, you, and Joy. We've been able to get that to a very a solid number that works for us every year. So, but I think that's a good thing to do for sure, is to set aside monies out of every check that you bring home if you're self-employed, and put that in a separate, tax retirement account as a savings account, and then pay your quarterly taxes out of that. And then at the end of the year, you can look at making retirement contributions out of that. And then if you have extra money left over, meaning that you've maxed out your SEP and you can't invest anything anymore, then you've got money that you can do other things with. You can do taxable investing, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And something else that's come to mind too, that's a reality I know for myself, and it could be a reality for others, is that 2020 I wasn't able, or I chose not to contribute to my retirement. I chose to preserve cash just because we didn't know, and still, we didn't know how long this was going to be going on. So, that's, in my opinion, I didn't like having to do that because we were such in the habit of contributing toward retirement every year. To take a year off, like, it was a bummer, but you just get back on and you start getting in that habit and doing it again. So I think that's just from my perspective. If anybody did have to take a year off, just try to jump back in and start those contributions up as soon as you can to get back on track, because it was tough to lose that year of work for sure.
Yeah. One thing I will add too, Chris, is that I've had a lot of long-term clients who, not a lot, but I had some, I should say, I've had a few long-term clients that we had to make a decision last year not to make retirement contributions. And the reason why I say that they're long-term clients is to give you perspective, to say they've been with me long enough to feel my push every year to get as much into retirement as we can, so that when this happened, it felt really bad. It felt wrong. It felt dirty, like, oh, we're not making retirement contributions. Oh my gosh, Troy, it's awful. And I can't tell you, and it's a small handful of clients that I've had these conversations with. But the key to remember is this: 1 year of not making a retirement contribution is not going to hurt you. Habitually not making retirement contributions will hurt you. So that's the difference. And to prove the point that, my clients, we've talked about this. You and I talked about it, that, it's not going to hurt you. It's 1 year, right? We'll be fine, right? But it's understanding the difference between making a habit of not making a contribution versus making a habit of making a contribution. Big difference.
Yeah. And something that helped me mentally, Troy, and I don't know if this will help others, but I looked at it as, and these are not real numbers, but let's say I'd always planned on retiring at 65. I literally had looked at 2020 as, I took a year of my retirement early and spent it with my family, and just enjoyed that time I had involuntarily. But now I'm going to retire at 66. And that's what helped me mentally. It's like, I'm still on track. I'm just going to retire a year later. I took a year of my retirement already. That's the way I looked at it.
And that's that's a fair way to look at it. But I would say we'll see. We'll probably still be able to get there. And again, it's just doing what we can, and then looking and evaluating as we move along, right? Because I just mentioned something there that I think is important for people to hear too, is that we can only do what we can do, right? And sometimes we look back at things and we say, oh, shoulda, woulda, coulda, but still we can only do what we can do. And I know this sounds very simplistic and maybe even juvenile, but look, if we can't walk around comparing ourselves to say, look, my neighbor's got this, they're going to retire at 60 or that. The key is becoming the best version of yourself financially. That should be your measuring stick, right? And that's how we should look and compare. So it's not about Chris against any other demographic. It should be Chris against Chris, and getting Chris Lisle to become the best version of him financially. And taking a year off from a retirement contribution is not going to disrupt that. It's going to be a small bump in the road, just like 2008 to 2009. The people that were investing during that time, that was a painfully difficult time to be in investments. It was scary, right? But now think back at it. we just think about it as a a bump in the road, right? But if you
Hmm.
can go back and think about what it felt like then, and again, this kind of proves my point about the recency bias, right? That we don't think much about that because we're past it, and the last 11 years have been great. So
Right.
taking a year off is okay,
Yeah,
and our goal is to do the best that we can with what we have to become the best version of yourself financially.
absolutely. Well, there's definitely a couple other topics I want to talk about as we talk about our big financial picture. And I know especially this next topic is so broad. I just would love for you to just give us some insight. But let's talk about the stock market for a minute. And because that does relate to retirement to some degree in terms of where people might have some investments and retirement plans. The stock market over the past 15 months since the pandemic rolled out in February, March of last year has kind of done some unique things. What are your feelings on it right now? Where are we at right now with the market and what you're seeing?
Well, it's interesting. So the market has been surprisingly good. March was a difficult month for the stock market. April was the best month for the stock market since the 1980s. So go figure, right? It's been crazy, but it's still been strong. People ask questions similar to this, quite often to me, and I'll refer back to my guru, a guy who I looked up as I started out in the planning world, and he would always answer people who said, "Hey, what do you think the stock market's going to do next?" And he would always say, "Look, I don't know which direction the next 20% move in the stock market would be." Meaning, I don't know if it's going to go up 20% next or if it's going to go down 20% next. I don't know that, he would say. But he would say, but I do know which direction the next 100% move would be. So if you think about it, he's saying, I don't know if the market in the short term is going to go up or down 20%. But he's saying, I know the market will not go down 100%, that the market will go up 100%. I don't know how long that'll take, but over the long term, and again, what he's getting at is the importance of long term in the market.
Mhm.
People are looking, if you think about short term, your perspective, in my opinion, professionally, is misguided. We need to be long term investors looking at the long term. We shouldn't be looking at short term investments um, uh, from that perspective, right? So if we're doing things right in the market, we're looking at it long term. We're buyers, right, during these times. So we're continuing to contribute to 401k plans, to retirement plans, meaning we're buying into the market. Um, the market's been strong. It's been strong since the market's opened,
Yeah.
way back when. So we have historical precedent on that. We can see it. We can see numbers. We hear people talking about things like virtual currencies, cryptocurrencies, right? Should I invest in those? They're very short lived. We don't have a lot of history on them. They're very, very risky, right? And whereas we can measure risk in the market because we've seen it, we have this long history. We have a short history in virtual currencies, and they're very, very dangerous. And that's not to say, look, somebody might put money in the market tomorrow and the market could move down 20% and a virtual currency could go up 50. We don't know. But in the long term, that's what matters. Another way that I'll lay it out to you is a baseball analogy, right? I'm a sports guy. So um, my favorite hitter in professional baseball was a guy named Tony Gwynn. Tony Gwynn was like the best hitter. He seldom struck out. He didn't hit for power, but he was one of the best hitters of all time. So he would hit singles, doubles, occasional triple, occasional, home run, but he didn't strike out. Now you can look at the home run hitters, the guys trying to swing for the fence, they're striking out a lot. So when it comes to finances, we can't strike out. We can't afford to strike out. So we need to be hitting doubles, singles, and hitting for average, not for power, right?
Right.
And the same, that's why that analogy I think is really important to where we are today. And then you have to couple that with understanding your risk, right?
Mhm.
How much risk you can take on.
Gotcha. No, that's great insight, and I think that's exactly what I was looking for here in this conversation. So thank you for sharing that. One other piece about people's financial world, the big picture of their financial world, that sometimes gets, I won't say gets overlooked, but not gets reviewed or studied as often as it should, in my opinion at least, is insurance reviews. And I'm talking about insurance across the board. Can you speak a little bit on the importance of regular reviews of your coverages and those different aspects of insurance?
Yeah, we have a policy in my practice that we generally review insurance every 3 to 5 years, depending on the situation. We ramped it up last year, the last couple of years, and did it a little earlier just because everything going on in the real estate market here in Nashville, which leads to understanding how much your homeowner's coverage, how much coverage you should have on the homeowner side. But yeah, you need to review your health insurance just to make sure that you're properly covered and that you have good coverage. Sometimes for those who are employed, the best opportunity of coverage is through your employer, through what's offered there. But when we talk about insurance, the reason why I mentioned health insurance is because that's what most people think about right away. Insurance, oh, health insurance, well, I'm covered, I'm good, I don't need to mess with anything else. But there's much more that we need to look at. We need to look at life insurance. Do we need life insurance? Do we have a life insurance need? Would we need to replace income if something happened to me? We need to look at our auto coverages, our homeowners coverage. Do we have an umbrella policy? We need to look at disability insurance. Later on, the possibility of long-term care. And I'm a big fan of fee-only financial planning, right? So I think it's important to ask those questions and have someone who's unbiased, not trying to sell you insurance products to make a commission, help you to review that. And if you're smart enough and can do it on your own, then do it on your own by all means. But understanding what your needs are and reviewing those is really important. I'll give you a quick example of that is looking at the real estate market in Nashville, how it's really, really grown and it's gotten crazy, right? So with that in mind, if your house was valued at, let's say if somebody had a $500,000 house and the lot is worth $100,000, then the dwelling should be covered for $400,000. Well, if that's the policy that you have, and that's what it was, let's say 5 years ago, and now that house is worth $750,000 and the lot's worth $150,000. Well, now you've got a $600,000 dwelling exposure with the coverage for $400,000. So, speaking to your agents to make sure that works is really important, very much so.
Gotcha. Well, we've covered a lot today for sure, and the world of financial planning and really our finances as a whole. There's just so much involved. I mean, I know it can get overwhelming. It can sound overwhelming, but it's obviously a very key, important part of life, and having a plan and acting on that plan is important. So, I appreciate your insights and your wealth of knowledge, no pun intended, on this subject. Troy, you're Nashville based. How can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about your practice or just options in the financial planning world?
Well, I'll say a couple things. One is folks can look at my website to find information about me. I've written a lot. There's a lot of information on my website, on my blog. I haven't written much in the last couple of years because I've been working on some other things, but all of that blog stuff, if you read back through it, there's a lot of wisdom in there. My website is Von Haefen Financial Management. .com. So you can Google Von Haefen Financial Management. The website is www.vhfinancialmanagement.com. But I'll also encourage people that, look, if you need help, there's lots of advisors out there. You can look at the Alliance of Comprehensive Planners and the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors. Both of those organizations are fee-only financial advisors. You can find advisors in your area. And again, I would encourage you to look for a fee-only fiduciary advisor. And fiduciary is a funny word, just means that advisor that puts the client's interest before theirs. They don't sell anything, no products, no commissions. And that's really, really important. I do like ACP, the Alliance of Comprehensive Planners, because not only are they fee only. They're also holistic, meaning that they look at the tax perspective as well, which is a key part to your financial health. So, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, again, I'm excited that we're having a conversation about rebuilding your finances and talking about the big picture of finances, because that means, at least in a lot of our worlds, that work is starting to happen and people are starting to have an income roll in again. And so the idea of replenishing things we might have lost over the past 15 months, or to pay off some debt we might have incurred over the past 15 months, is an awesome conversation to have right now. And so, as always, Troy, I appreciate you being a partner to TCW and a resource, and your time today. Any last words for us?
No, well, thanks for having me. Always good to be with you and spend time with you. I'm with you. I'm just glad to see that we're starting to pull out of this. I feel bad for an industry that's near and dear to my heart, that has been hit hard and has not really had the light, shined on it the way that it should have, nationally in the media. I feel the music industry's been hit really, really hard, and we just haven't heard a lot about it. So I'm really glad to see that we're starting to move in the right direction. And look, the good news is that we're heading in the right direction. And just keep that same perspective about your personal finances. Know that wherever you are now, that's where we are, and now it's time to move forward. Whether you're in great shape or you're not in as good a shape as you want to be, we can still move forward. And let's go out there and do it, and just do the right things. It doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be complex, but it does need to be wise and prudent. I just encourage everyone to get out there and take care of your personal finances as well.
Awesome. Well, again, we're very appreciative to Troy Von Haefen for joining us today as part of the CMA video series. And we look forward to our next episode and providing some more awesome content for everyone. We will see you all again very soon.